Welcome to the Jaron Jarvis channel. I am Jaron Jarvis. Today, I would like to introduce to you, my sister died as a child. I'm glad she missed it all. I woke up last Monday morning to find my mother dead. She'd cut the major blood vessels in her arms and legs and bled to death laying on her bed. Were it not for the blood, one could mistake her for a sleeping woman, a very pale and still sleeping woman. Not me, of course. I knew she was dead. She left a note. It contained no explanation for why she killed herself. I didn't need one. The moment I saw her lifeless body, circled by all that cold blood, I knew. And I know when it all started. I can still remember the smell, the awful thick smell of burning diesel fuel. We were just walking down the street, then suddenly we weren't. I was knocked into an alley, at least I think I was. That's the next place I remember being. It was loud and black smoke was everywhere. I was scared and confused. I was only 10 years old. I felt my brother touch my hand and heard my mother scream our names in order, but that's it. As I am told sometimes happens, I don't have many clear memories of that day. Other than those few flashes of the actual thing, I only remember being back at home with my brothers. I can still see Hyder, my oldest brother, pacing back and forth, waiting for mother. As time passed, it occurred to me that perhaps she wouldn't return. She did return, though. It was very late. She carried a bundle wrapped tightly in her arms. I was young, but I couldn't imagine what she could possibly have in that package that she held to herself. So, what could be so precious? Had she been shopping while we were here worrying about her? Her face was drawn and smeared with black. She didn't look at any of us, she just stumbled towards the bathroom. Then I noticed the other woman, a neighbor woman, had slid silently in behind mother. I had seen this woman before, but I didn't know her name. She set Zara down in the kitchen, nodded and slipped back out into the city. Hassan and I rushed to comfort our sister, relieved to see her there. She was so small, seeming even smaller than I remembered her ever being. Her face was blackened, with streaks of clean skin following the path her tears had taken down her cheeks. She reached out for us with bandaged hands and Hassan picked her up and held her until she fell asleep. Of course Amina, our other sister, had been the package mother had hugged so tightly to her chest. I barely remember those first few days. Mother had spent that morning washing her dear one for burial and wailing her misery down the drain, so she wouldn't have to at the funeral. We had managed to make it so long without being touched by all the fighting. When it finally struck our family, it hit hard. I suppose we were never going to get out of it without paying something. Sometimes, when a great trauma like this happens, it can let something into you. Some of you reading this know what I mean. The world is rent so deeply that it feels beyond any chance of healing, and yet, it continues on for everyone else, as if nothing has happened at all. Some people end up with wounds that never heal, that fester into something else, something dangerous. Mother became more insistent in her very rare calls from father, that he get us out. She didn't let us children leave our property for months. We had the yard, surrounded by the high wall, but that was it. If she caught us peeking over it, she would shout that a sniper could see us. Mother would even shop alone, carrying groceries back with no help. Even after she started to settle down, we rarely left, praying at home, even on Fridays. It was worst for poor Zara. Her recovery was difficult to say the least. She had terrible nighttime fits, sometimes waking us up laughing hysterically, other times screaming. None of that helped mother's worry. Zara wasn't even allowed outside. She was the only daughter now, and not only had she lost her own twin, but mother's vigil over her never ended. It was overbearing. She put up devotional portraits and pictures all over, but especially over Zara's bed. What if there's a sniper or another bomb, or an American mistakes you for someone they're looking for? It's happened before. She would insist. She wasn't wrong, and we did our best not to complain. After all, what hardship did we have compared to hers? As time went on, Haida spoke to Hamid, Hassan and I several times about obeying mother, but we younger boys were growing weary of playing only in the yard and we missed our friends. When it came time to finally unwrap Zara's hands, however, We were ashamed to have thought our own lives so tough. The doctors had done their best, at least Mother insisted they had, but they'd been unable to save her fingers. Mother eventually told us our sister had been burned trying to pull poor Amina away from the flames, and the injury was so severe, her fingers simply fell away from her. The years of my youth passed by me like a blur. I think hard to remember them now. My own homeland is almost a fiction to my mind, as if my dream self made it all up. When I was 13, 3 years after the bomb, my father came home again. He blew into the house like a sea wind, bringing the hint of things so exotic they can't be imagined by a family so simple as ours. But it was all real. That Friday we were gone, flying to a new place, a safer place, a place my father had worked for years to get us to, and a place my mother insisted, through tears of joy and anxiety, would bring us a new start and peace at last. It was cold when we got off the plane. A tall white man in a uniform waved and smiled at my father. They embraced as friends. I realized only then what my father had done all those years, what he'd done for us. I had resented him for leaving my beloved mother alone for so long, bearing the burden of caring for our family and shouldering Amina's death with no support from her husband. The hug from that strange soldier explained more to me than my father ever would. Both our parents had sacrificed for us. The man drove us to a house with a short fence around it, not a wall. There was snow on the ground. It was the first time I had ever seen snow. The soldier bent down and put some in his mouth. We all followed suit. It was cold, but so pure and pleasant. It alone fulfilled my idea of what this new country would be. The man stayed and talked with my father for more than an hour in our new house. We all gathered there and listened, enchanted by the sound of our own father's voice speaking a language we couldn't understand. We did our best to settle in. It was so different at first, so cold, but there were lots of other families like ours in the neighborhood. It felt like we all got settled together to make it easier on us. Even with that, Mother was reluctant to let us stray too far. Especially Zara. I had at least managed to convince her that I should start school as soon as possible, if I was to have any hope of getting into a college here as she wanted. Father's friend walked me the few blocks to school to enroll in remedial English training. Mother was waiting for us with the door open when we returned, with Zara by her side. They smiled and waved at us. It felt like things were starting to go right again. 2 weeks later my father fell right there in the yard, shoveling fresh snow. His heart failed. Father had been away for so much of my life, his loss wasn't so great for me. It was all so sudden. Haida had to get a job right away to support us. Mother started pulling us in even tighter. She started talking about the curse that had fallen on our family, that we were marked that day, the day Amina was killed. She started putting up more religious symbols in the hopes they would protect us. Though she tried, she couldn't control the boys as easily as when we were young, especially Haida and Hassan. They were old enough now that they were essentially men. Hamed had it hard though, he was such a loving boy. Even though he was older than me, he couldn't refuse Mother's pleas to stay home with her. And that's where he spent most days. He had to be the good son. And she pulled Zara tightest of all. She never had a chance. Mother started keeping my little sister in hijab, even in the house. It was an odd thing. Mother had always said she would let the girls choose for themselves, where she hadn't been allowed to choose. But something changed her mind. She insisted, at first, that Zara wear it for the cold in this new country. But even when spring came, she still wrapped the hijab every morning before letting her leave the bedroom they'd started sharing after Father's death. I was young, but I was starting to see the cracks, the anxiety that drove her compulsion and the little things she did to keep it all in line. The hijab was normal for Mother. It was a piece of home that made her feel safe, let her feel she could control something in this world that was wildly out of control. I worried about Zara, and Mother, but I was just hitting puberty, and my whole world was in a tumult. I had little time to spend concerned for anything but myself. I was growing apart from the family as it seemed to be drawing into itself. I concentrated on studying and stayed in the library many afternoons as late as I could. The next fall I left the English intensive and was allowed to enroll in regular classes. I was a freshman. Haida and Hassan were both working full-time then. When flu season hit that year, Hamed took ill. He didn't even go to school, so mother was convinced I'd brought the sickness in. She quickly became overwhelmed trying to care for him and Zara. With her distracted, I happily slipped away even more than normal. I should have felt guiltier, but I hated being in that house, it was oppressive. But I was wrong, I should have spent as much time there with my family as I could. I was so caught up in my own life, that didn't realize how bad Hamed was. Then the day came when I arrived home from school to find no one there. Hamed died that night, in the hospital. It was pneumonia, he went so quickly. I couldn't believe it could happen again, why did they keep dying? After the funeral, mother sat us boys together in the living room, Haida, Hassan and me. She told us father and Hamed's deaths were caused by a dark spirit that had followed us since the bomb. She insisted that Zara was supposed to die that day with her twin and now the darkness is always with her. I would have laughed, but she went even further. She had been thinking it all through. Father had let Zara come out and play in the snow while he shoveled. When she got cold, he collapsed carrying her inside. Before Hamed was sick, she had started coughing. Being the good brother he was, he sat with her and sang her favorite songs. Mother said he'd taken it from her, the sickness, just as father had taken the cold from her, but the spirit was always seeking Zara. For a moment, I actually started to buy in, she was so frantic, so convinced of it all. But it couldn't be true. I didn't believe in that sort of thing to begin with, and certainly not now that I live in a country that has no magic and doesn't even seem to believe in any religion, not really. But what could I do? She's my mother, and she'd lost 2 children and her husband and was living in a country where she spoke not the language and understood not the culture. She was isolated, all she had was her poor disabled daughter. She needed her, she would never be able to live without her, especially if she was afraid of the curse or spirit or whatever coming for her. Then she solidified her madness for me. She insisted we all stay here, in the house, with her. That was too much, this wasn't about Zara, this was about mother. That's when the seed was planted. Zara wasn't the only one there at each death, mother had been there for all of them. I hadn't seen what happened to Amina, none of us had. Only mother. I didn't know what to do. I was raised to obey my parents above all, but God. But I'd gotten a taste of what my life could be, would be here. I wanted to forget about my rural, backwards family who believed in ghosts. I couldn't fight her and I couldn't leave, not yet. From that day on, I was at home as little as possible and I lived a different life at school, pretending I was someone else and my family was normal. I was selfish, but I had to be. The following year Haida was struck by a car on our street, walking home from work. He died right there in front of the house. I was on my way home from school when I saw the flashing lights. My stomach dropped, I knew what it was. Mother was standing inside doorway, clutching Zara, staring at my poor brother laying on his back as the EMTs worked on him. She didn't even go to him. Hassan stopped coming home from work a few months after that, he was the smart one. I'd become numb to it all by then. Whether it really was a curse or something more human, didn't really matter. They were all gone. I kept walking to school, but in a fog. It was becoming harder to feign normalcy, everything was slipping. There was no money coming in but the tiny stipend the government afforded us for rent. Not that it mattered, mother wouldn't even leave the house to grocery shop anymore. Then this morning, it all changed. After the police took her body away, I felt it, something lifted. The woman from the Islamic center called and told me they'd received her body from the morgue and asked if I had female family members to wash her before burial. I told her there were none. It finally hit me. Then the tears came. It felt like my insides were being ripped out. It was the worst pain I've ever experienced, worse than any of the others by far. My mother, she was gone forever. I felt suddenly lost in the world, utterly lost. I started to forgive her for all the things she'd put us through, but as they recounted in my mind, the tears dried up. I got angry. It was her fault, she'd done it all. Whether by her madness, or truly by her hand, she'd destroyed the family. And she'd left me here alone. Just me and Zara. It wasn't fair. I felt my sister touch my shoulder gently. "Brother, what's wrong?" she asked in accented English. I turned to see her round face, bordered by that vibrant blue fabric, the one patterned with delicate green blooms, Mother's favorite. I thought about the note she had left, her suicide note. She didn't explain herself in it, but she did leave me some instructions. She told me how to wrap a hijab, so I could help my poor sister, my sister who has no fingers with which to pull the fabric tightly around her own face. Of all the things to write to me, why was it so important to hide my poor sister's hair? I reached to yank that lovely cloth from her young head, then stopped. Beneath my grip the fabric was so soft and delicate, like my sister. She didn't deserve this, none of this. I wouldn't take out my frustration on her, my darling sister. She should have been loved and encouraged to grow, not stifled in this house and under this madness. "You don't have to wear this in the house anymore," I started. She touched my wrist with her stump, but didn't stop me. "You don't have to wear it at all. It's your choice now. Do you want to keep it?" I asked. It wasn't really a question, though. I was upset and I wanted to throw that thing my mother forced on her away. "No, I don't want it," she said quietly. I peeled it off. Her hair beneath was combed back and wonderfully smooth. Her eyes, like shining black gems, smiled up at me. I hugged her tightly and cried into her shoulder. I felt relief. I walked down the street and bought a pizza for us to share all the money I could scrounge up. We sat in front of the TV and ate together silently. I felt calm, unburdened. I was sad, but I felt like I had something to look forward to now. No one to be beholden to, it was just her and I. "Where is my hijab?" Zara asked me as we sat. I pulled it out from under the pizza box. "Do you want to go out?" I asked her, disappointed that she wanted to put it back on. She shook her head and smiled. Her smile made me smile. At that moment I knew we were going to be okay. "No, I don't want it," she said. Then she sat silently for a few moments staring at the TV, but I could see there was something else she wanted to say. She turned to me with a very serious expression. I was ready with a brotherly hug, but she spoke. I asked her not to keep me in here, she said. Her tone was more intense than I'd ever heard from her. I know. "I'm sorry, Zara." I started before her words really sunk in. I was already close to tears thinking of the years she'd spent tied to Mother. It was only just hitting me how hard it must have been for her. For so long she'd just been my sister, but she's a whole person, not just her interactions with me. To have almost never left the house in years, never been to school, spoken to no one outside her immediate family, it must have been a tortured life. My heart pained for her and I felt guilt for not having helped her sooner. I didn't want to do it, but she wouldn't let me go. She added. That stopped my breath. A flash of Mother's cold body on her bed invaded my mind. "What did you do, Zara?" I asked, almost a whisper. "Our brothers and father. I'm sorry, I didn't want to. Each time I was sure she'd give in and let me go, but she just couldn't," she said, still staring up at me. I think she finally realized it was all her fault. She could have just let me go and they'd all be alive now. "That's why she killed herself," she said, finally looking away. Her eyes fell on the hijab in my hand, and my gaze followed. She stood. "I'm going. Thank you. I love you." She kissed my cheek. I didn't move, trying to work through what she'd said to me. Was she as mad as Mother by the end? She opened the front door, though I'm not sure how she turned the knob, then looked back at me. "Burn that for me, brother?" she asked, then turned away. I stared down at the beautiful cloth clenched in my hand, stunned and confused. Then I saw it. I spread the thing out beside me on the couch. The inside, the part that would lay against Zara's hair, it had a different panel in it. There was a second thin, silk cloth sewn into it. It had the intricate, smoky text so familiar to me from the Islamic calligraphy Mother had hanging on our walls. Some of the words I could read, but others were either too elaborately written to recognize or were simply foreign to me. What was clear was the intent of the invocation. It was a prayer for protection from dark things, spirits, the evil eye and demons. I felt my stomach knot up. Sometimes, when violent trauma comes to you, it can let something in. I stared out the still open door into the night and wondered if I should go try to stop her. But I didn't, I couldn't. She's still my sister, isn't she?